Well, good morning or good afternoon to everybody. Today we will present a secondee that is Frank Tros. He's in Sao Paulo. We have Graciela Il. She has a problem, and then she cannot stay in this presentation and the next one also. But we are here to present a Frank that is since 1999 affiliated to University of Amsterdam in Netherlands. He has a master's degree in sociology at the University of Groningen in 1992, PhD social science at Utrecht University in 2000. And Frank is a senior researcher and is in senior researcher in Institute for Multidisciplinary Research and Teaching in Labor Studies at the Law Faculty of the University of Amsterdam. And Frank's occupational field is focused on mostly qualitative research in labor markets, employment relations, and human relations, and organizational studies in general. He initiated and coordinated several national and international projects co-founded by the European Commission. His publications are about the relationship between flexibility and security in labor market. We know this concept, flexicurity, policy concept, intergenerational issues in labor, institutional and organizational change in collective bargaining, trade unions and employer power, resources and collective actions in industrial relations, and welfare state reform. Frank is involved also in cross-country comparative, as now that is in Brazil. Frank, thank you so much. Please present your communication, starting for the title, please. Thank you very much for stay here with us today.
Thank you so much, Sandra, for your introduction. And it's an honor for me to be part of the INCASI network and give you an overview of the work that I would like to present and discuss with you about the role of unions in wage inequality and what lessons we might learn by comparing Europe and Brazil. I think it's good to already give some part of my message is that we in Brazil, we see a stagnating reduction of wage inequality, and there are quite a lot of challenges in the Brazilian labor market and industrial relations system because of a fragmented collective bargaining structure, because of a labor market reform from 2017 in Brazil, and because of low connections between unions and the growing shares of precarious workers in Brazil. What I did here in the secondment is I make a explorative multidisciplinary literature review, economics, sociology, political, law, about firstly, what are the effects of industrial relations towards levels of wage inequality in labor markets. Further, I did several network activities by presentations and discussions in 5 research centers in Brazil. More concrete, the research questions there was, what is the role of unions in wage inequality, in regulating or addressing the problem of wage inequality? What are their views? What are their capacities, power resources, and what might be the effects of these activities trade unions can do in reducing or regulating wage inequality of equality? Why the topic? It's a classical topic, but there is new relevance in Europe and also in Brazil. First, the academic relevance is still that what are mechanisms, how do trade unions regulate equality and inequality? Labor economics give a lot of quantitative research, and mostly they say there is a negative relationships between unionization, collective bargaining, coverage, and wage inequality. So the more unions are involved and the more collective regulations there are, the less inequality there is. But there are new political relevance because we have a new 2 years ago, a European directive of adequate minimum wages that remarkably and interestingly also make relationship towards collective bargaining parties, that they can also have a role in reducing the inequality and leveling up minimum wages by collective bargaining. Also in Brazil, there is a political relevance. There was a period of higher minimum wages regulations, but that is done. That was effectful for reducing wage inequality, but the last 7 years it is it's quiet in the minimum wages, and the wage inequality is raising again the last years. And we have, of course, a lot of social problems by too much wage inequality. We have growing shares of precarious workers with low income, low job security, and we have high inflation rates. So especially low-waged workers are affected by low income in their power to buy and to live. There are also literature about injustice, feelings of unfairness and injustice, that some people earn very much and other people earn very low. What is negative for the cohesion in the social in a society, and that also can give feelings of mistrust in the labor market. And of course, I think it's also very important that low wage and precarious workers are included in trade union movements and in trade union organization and in the actions of trade unions to defend their rights and to increase their living standards. Very fast. There are several dimensions of wage inequality. We can look to inequality between wages and capital, of labor and capital, how much of the gross domestic products goes to the factor of labor. This is one dimension. Another dimension where I look more to is the wage inequality between workers. So in their earnings, a vertical dimension, the difference between low-paid workers and high-paid workers. I come back to that in the next slide. And we have a kind of horizontal wage inequality, that people are paid the same level for the same professions, or for the same jobs, between firms, between regions. And also, of course, I don't go into that detail, but you have also the workers' population characteristics that can be determined in wage inequality by gender, by race, or by age. For example, in the Netherlands, we have still age discrimination by young people who have lower minimum wages. But I'm looking to the vertical dimension. Here, a very snapshot of the recent data, just a picture of the last year in the vertical dimension of inequality between Brazil and one country in Europe. I took the Netherlands in this case. In the working paper, I will elaborate more about the differences between European countries, but here between Brazil and the Netherlands, we see higher wage inequality in Brazil. Especially, we see higher inequality in the upper half of the working population distributions in deciles. Those are this. Maybe you are used to this kind of, this is the same as the Gini coefficients in the income inequality. You can also look to wages as one of the biggest part of income are wages. And then you divide the working population in 10 deciles, and you take there the average of this 10%, and then you divide the higher by the lower. So one is, the higher the ratio, the more inequality there is. What I learned from people in Brazil is they look especially to the Palma wage inequality. That's the lowest one. Then you divide the top 10 by the total bottom of 40%. That is related also by the wage distribution in Brazil. There's a lot of people living in the lowest wage deciles. Yes. What I also found a bit special, I have to look further into that also the Netherlands have a high share of low-paid workers. That might be that we have to look to who that are. That might be the students that have side jobs on the side. I look to the union's context in Europe and Brazil more in a general way. In what environments do they act? In what environment of industrial relations and labor market? And on an abstract level, you see quite a lot of similarities. You see in all countries decreasing membership of unions. You see in all countries difficulties organizing, mobilizing low-paid workers, platform workers, new generations of workers, but also flexible workers, people in not the regular but atypical forms of work, low organizing levels in trade unions. We see instability in collective bargaining coverage. Scandinavia, Belgium, there's it's quite stable, but in all the other countries it's decreasing and sometimes even marginalizing. We see neoliberal labor market reforms in promoting flexible work with less job security, sometimes with lower social rights for workers and also lower negotiation rights for trade unions, as in Brazil. And we see that trade unions, it's less evident that trade unions have access to lobbies and influence in governments. That's also the case in Brazil nowadays. There's Silva, but the political constellation is much more diverse, that it's not that easy for unions to make pressure on raising minimum wages or making better rights for platform workers. The difference, of course, I say nothing new, that there's very different histories in labor relations. There's much more informal work in Brazil, like in other Latin American countries, and that the wage inequality is structurally higher. Even kijken, dan now I have to click to the next one. Even kijken, how can I? Yeah. Here I go a little bit faster because of the time. I think I will write it more in my working paper. There's a lot of literature saying that there is a relationship between industrial relations characteristics and wage inequality. And there's a lot of literature in Europe. I take that first as a starting point, that the coverage of collective bargaining, so the share of workers falling under these sector and company level agreements with unions and employers. This is positively related to equality. So the higher the coverage, the less inequality, like the Nordic countries. And you see the Eastern European countries who have fragmented low bargaining coverage and high inequality. far higher in wage inequality in Europe, the Eastern European countries. That's the same with the level of collective bargaining. The higher the level, the more equality. What I do not see that much in the literature, but what's really important, I think, is what is agreed in the agreements, how collective wage increases are structured. For example, in the Netherlands, we have a trade union strategy to give as an increase of wages also an amount of the increase, what is relatively higher for the low income workers. So it's a strategy of leveling wage structures in the agreement itself. That's the same with unions. Mostly the higher the union membership, the higher equality, but that is not always the case. In France and Spain, there's not that much trade union unionization levels, but there is quite a lot relatively of equality. So that's all with these issues. It's not a one-dimensional thing, the higher, but there are more factors included. If I go to the state support is really important. The statutory minimum wage is one of the most effective mechanism to reduce wage inequality. So the minimum wage by law for everybody in an employment relationships. The higher you make that, the less the ratio will decrease of wage inequality. And of course, the extension of sector agreements has also its effect on more equality. There's also literature about interconnections, about the European directive, for example. They relate collective bargaining coverage with higher the statutory minimum wage. Both are important and enforce each other, because trade unions start with the minimum wage to scale it up in their collective bargaining agreements, but reduce the inequality. What I think it's interesting to look to is the new European directive of adequate minimum wages that has to be transposed to the member states, sorry. It has several goals, several aims. Most important is to give workers adequate wages, but also reducing of wage inequality as such is a sub-theme, sub-aim of this directive. And that is quite, I think quite of another kind of, I was really, it is really remarkable that they see the strengthening of collective bargaining parties as a way to reduce wage inequality. This message is very different than the years after the Great Recession in Europe, where they said, well, collective agreements and unions are all rigidities on the labor market. They see it and is negative for the market, for employment, for the dynamics in business. Now they see it as important for another reason of reducing wage inequality. We have to see what are the impacts, because the countries now are making national plans to increase the collective bargaining coverage. That means centralization of collective bargaining, because then you have more people under it, less inequality. Yeah, I have just also edited a book. It was about decentralization. That is what we saw most the last 10 years, decentralization of collective bargaining structures and strategies. So we have to see how this will work out in the several member states of Europe that are very different. Well, I also present this model to some experts, and I presented this model. It is far away of the Brazilian context in the moment, where there is no state support for collective bargaining, but more the other way around. Now here I show just some, maybe you know it. These are, this is a figure that gives the bars give the current latest data situation of collective bargaining coverage. So the European directive talks about 80% of collective bargaining coverage, and we see just 5 countries, the first 5, are having that, and the other ones are really low. So it is a very ambitious directive, I would say. The challenges in Brazil and some comparative lessons. I make a summary of it. We can discuss about it, because I think it's also sometimes visible in other Latin American countries. We see in Brazil a decentralized and very fragmented wage bargaining that hinder the reduction of inequality. Cardoso make also a comparison with 3 other Latin American countries, and these ones are more centralized and coordinated, and they are more successful in reducing wage inequality than Brazil. Brazil is an outlier in that, where there's less reduction of wage inequality because of this structure, regional, by professions, etc. The labor market reform from 2017 in Brazil is still working. It is, and this was quite impactful in flexibilization of the labor market, and also in giving unions less right in representing workers and making agreements, both. So there are more vulnerable, precarious workers in the labor market in Brazil because of this reform. Unions has less rights and less capacities to do something about it. This in Europe, we have had, of course, a lot of flexicurity was already mentioned. We have had a lot of experiences about making flexible workers a normal phenomenon in the labor market. And it turns out, I think it's evident, that it's difficult to regulate them by governments and by unions, giving them mostly a precarious situation. There's a structural problem with precarious workers in Brazil. Of course, there's a really high share of informal workers. That's really a very different point than at least in the North and Western European countries. Platform and app workers, there's a lot of research activities going on in Brazil about that, why they do not join collective actions when the situation is so bad for Uber drivers, other platform workers. There's a lot of mistrust and prejudices towards unions. Let's say the picture is a bit, oh, they want to have my money, they are bureaucratic, are they really for us? It's not. Having people have the picture of independent free workers, and trade unions said, you are precarious, you have to be defended, and you have to have social rights. It's a difficult rhetoric to connect to these new groups of people in these situations. I think Europe has also some similar problems, but there are also initiatives to organize platform workers, not only by trade unions, but also by other associations of social movements. And as a last point, Brazil is more missing the state support. If you see the European directive, at least as a kind of institutional support for unions and collective bargaining parties to be more active in collective bargaining and to do something about the wage regulations. In Brazil, this is now, since 2018, missing. Yeah, I think I would like to stop here. Yeah.
Okay.